Have you ever felt the haunting sensation that your own body was turning into an enemy, whispering threats of fire and pain in the dead of night when the rest of the world is wrapped in peaceful slumber? As a physician who has walked the sterile corridors of hospitals for over 30 years and looked into the weary eyes of more than 30,000 patients, I have learned that the most profound stories are often told in the hushed tones of a consultation room, far from the cold glare of surgical lights. I am Dr. Sanjay Gupta, and my journey has been defined by a relentless search for the truth hidden beneath the layers of clinical jargon and the dismissive shrugs of a medical establishment that too often forgets the human soul behind the chart. I remember one crisp autumn afternoon in my Atlanta clinic when the door opened to reveal Margaret Thompson, a 78-year-old retired librarian from Savannah, Georgia.
Margaret was a woman of grace and quiet dignity, the kind of person who spent her life surrounded by the smell of old parchment and the gentle wisdom of books. But the woman sitting before me was a shadow of her former self. Her eyes were rimmed with a deep, bruised exhaustion, the kind that comes from weeks, perhaps months, of surviving on fragments of sleep. She didn't look at me at first. She stared at her hands, which were trembling slightly in her lap, before she finally spoke in a voice that cracked like dry leaves. "Doctor," she whispered, her voice trembling with a mix of shame and desperation, "I think I'm losing my mind. Every night, exactly at 3 o'clock in the morning, a fire starts in my feet. It's not a warmth and it's not an itch. It's as if I am standing directly in a fireplace, the heat searing through my skin. Yet when I throw off the covers and look down, there is nothing there. No flames, no redness, just a cold, indifferent room and a pain that makes me want to scream until my lungs fail." I leaned forward, placing my hand near hers, not as a clinical gesture, but as a silent promise that I was listening. Margaret went on to describe the countless visits she had made to other specialists before finding her way to my office. Each time she was met with a patronizing smile and a gentle pat on the shoulder. They told her, with a certainty that made my blood boil, that this was merely the price of admission for reaching her late 70s. "It's just age, Margaret," they had said, as if the calendar was a judge sentencing her to a life of torture. But as I sat there, I saw more than a patient. I saw a woman who used to spend her Sunday afternoons dancing with her husband in their sun-drenched garden in Savannah, a woman who now felt like she was walking on hot coals every time she tried to move. The dismissal of her pain as just age was not just a medical error, it was a betrayal of the sacred trust between a healer and the suffering. I knew, based on decades of research and the thousands of cases I had handled, that her nerves were not dying because of the passage of time, but because of a preventable catastrophe occurring beneath the surface of her skin. Inside every human being, there is a sprawling, intricate network of 45 miles of nerves, and biological electrical system long enough to stretch from the heart of New York City all the way to Philadelphia. These delicate fibers are what allow us to feel the world. The soft velvet of a rose petal, the firm grip of a grandchild's hand, the solid reassurance of the earth beneath our feet. For Margaret, this system was malfunctioning because the protective insulation of her nerves, a substance called myelin, was crumbling away like the rusted casing of an old wire. In my years of clinical observation, I have seen how the brain, when faced with these leaking electrical signals, becomes a chaotic translator of agony. When the Myelin Shield fails, the brain receives garbled, frantic messages that it can only interpret as burning, stabbing, or the sensation of 1,000 invisible needles. This is the cruel reality of peripheral neuropathy, a condition that currently holds more than 20 million Americans in a grip of daily torment. That is 1 in every 16 people you pass on the street, 1 in 16 grandmothers, fathers, and neighbors. Margaret's despair was a symptom of a systemic failure, not a natural decline. She told me she felt betrayed by her own nerves, and I felt a familiar surge of indignation on her behalf. Why had no one told her that her body was sending out an emergency broadcast? Those 3:00 a.m. fires were flare guns being fired into the dark, a desperate signal from her nervous system that it was starving. Clinical data suggests that early intervention can stop this process in its tracks, yet so many are told to simply live with it until the damage becomes an irreversible prison of numbness and disability. I looked at Margaret and saw the thousands of others like her, the construction workers, the teachers, the musicians who had been led to believe that their pain was permanent. I told her, "Margaret, you are not crazy, and you are not just old. Your body is screaming for a truth that has been hidden in plain sight, and we are going to find it together." Her tears, which she had been holding back with the strength of a librarian's discipline, finally fell, washing away the isolation of her struggle. This wasn't just a medical consultation, it was the beginning of a reclamation. We were going to look at the medications she was taking, the nutrients her cells were craving, and the hidden traps of modern medicine that had brought her to this breaking point. Her journey from the hot coals of Savannah back to the garden she loved started with the simple, revolutionary act of being heard. The fire she felt wasn't an ending, it was a call to arms. As we began to peel back the layers of her history, the clinical reality became clear. She was walking into a nutritional catastrophe with her eyes wide open, guided there by a system that had failed to warn her of the dangers lurking in her own medicine cabinet. The story of Margaret's feet was only the first chapter in a much larger, darker tale of a silent epidemic sweeping through our nation, but it was also a story of how, with the right knowledge, we can reignite the spark of life and silence the midnight fire forever. To understand the agony that Margaret and so many others endure, we must journey deep beneath the surface of the skin into a realm that I have spent 40 years exploring with the awe of a navigator discovering a new continent. Imagine, if you will, that your body is a magnificent, sprawling Victorian mansion, a masterpiece of architecture where every room must communicate with the central command of the brain. To facilitate this, the great architect installed 45 miles of intricate electrical wiring, a network so vast that it could stretch from the neon lights of Times Square in New York all the way to the historic Liberty Bell in Philadelphia. These are your nerves, the silent messengers of your soul, carrying the electrical sparks that allow you to feel the warmth of a summer breeze or the heartbreaking softness of a newborn's cheek. But even the finest copper wire is useless, even dangerous, without its protective casing. In the biological world, this vital insulation is a pearly, fatty substance known as myelin. It wraps around your nerve fibers in tight, rhythmic layers, acting exactly like the heavy rubber coating on a high-voltage power line. When this myelin is thick and healthy, electrical signals travel at breathtaking speeds, reaching their destination with crystal clarity. It is the reason a pianist can play a complex concerto without thinking, and why you can pull your hand away from a hot stove before you even realize you've been burned. However, a tragedy occurs when this insulation begins to fail, a process I have witnessed in thousands of clinical cases at my research center. When the myelin sheath starts to thin, crack, and eventually crumble away, the electrical signals, the very essence of your sensory life, begin to leak into the surrounding tissue. They short-circuit, misfiring with a chaotic energy that the brain simply cannot comprehend. I often tell my medical students at Harvard that the brain is a desperate translator. When it receives these garbled, static-filled messages from a damaged nerve, it has no choice but to interpret them as something primal and terrifying. It translates a simple breeze into a searing flame and the gentle pressure of a bedsheet into the stabbing of 1,000 invisible needles. This is not a figment of the patient's imagination. It is a catastrophic mechanical failure of the body's internal infrastructure. This condition, which we call peripheral neuropathy, is a silent thief of human dignity. It is a state where the insulation of your life is being stripped away, wire by wire, until the system goes haywire. Clinical studies have shown that once this crumbling begins, it creates a feedback loop of inflammation and further decay that rarely stops on its own. As a longtime researcher, I have sat through countless hours of microscopic analysis, watching the slow-motion collapse of these neural shields. It is a heartbreaking sight, like watching a majestic bridge slowly rust into the sea. More than 20 million Americans are currently living in this state of internal short-circuiting, yet so many remain unaware of the science behind their suffering. They feel the shocks and the burning, but they don't realize that their biological rubber coating is disappearing. This isn't just a minor glitch. It is a fundamental breakdown that leads to the death of the nerve cell itself. When the myelin is gone, the nerve fiber beneath, the axon, is left exposed to the harsh, toxic environment of a body in distress. Without its protection, the nerve eventually withers and dies, leading to the permanent numbness that I dread seeing in my patients. This is why I speak with such urgency. We aren't just talking about discomfort, we are talking about the preservation of the 45 miles of wiring that make you, you. We must understand that the fire Margaret felt was the sound of her insulation burning out, a warning that the system was on the verge of total collapse. If we can understand the science of the shield, we can begin the sacred work of rebuilding it piece by piece, before the light in the house goes out forever. I will never forget the day Robert Bob Miller walked into my office, his heavy boots scuffing against the floor, a man who had spent 42 years building the skyline of Detroit with his bare hands. At 82 years old, Bob was a mountain of a man, but he moved with a heartbreaking fragility, his eyes constantly darting to the floor as if he no longer trusted the earth to stay beneath him. He sat down heavily, his weathered hands gripping his knees, and presented me with a brown paper bag filled with his daily medications. "Doctor," he said, his voice thick with the gravel of a life spent on construction sites, "I've done everything they told me. I take my pills, I watch my sugar, but my feet, they're leaving me. I feel like I'm walking on clouds of cotton wool, and I'm terrified I'm going to fall and never get back up." As I sifted through his prescriptions, my heart sank when I pulled out a familiar bottle. Metformin. It is the most prescribed diabetes medication on the planet, used by over 150 million people to manage their blood sugar, and Bob had been taking it religiously for 15 years. I looked at this man who had lived a life of discipline and hard work, and I had to tell him that he had fallen into what I call the metformin trap. While this drug is a powerful tool for controlling glucose, it harbors a dark, often unspoken secret that many in the medical community choose to overlook. Metformin has a documented, clinically proven tendency to interfere with the absorption of vitamin B12 in the distal ileum of the small intestine. Studies from major research institutions have shown that between 10% and 30% of long-term metformin users develop a significant B12 deficiency. For a man like Bob, whose nerves were already under pressure from diabetes, this deficiency was like cutting the fuel lines to an engine that was already struggling. I explained to him that by being a perfect patient and taking his medicine every morning, he was unknowingly starving his nervous system of the one nutrient it needed to survive. The shock on his face was palpable. He felt as though the very system he trusted to keep him healthy had been quietly dismantling his ability to walk. The tragedy of Bob's situation is that it is so incredibly common, yet so rarely discussed in the 15-minute windows of standard doctor visits. We are so focused on the numbers, the blood sugar levels, the A1C, that we forget to look at the collateral damage. Bob wasn't just losing his balance, he was losing his independence, his ability to take his grandchildren to the park, and his sense of self as a strong, capable man. The loss of B12 means the loss of the ability to repair that myelin insulation we discussed. For Bob, the metformin was acting as a chemical wall, blocking the life-saving B12 from ever reaching his bloodstream. It is a silent heist happening inside the digestive tracts of millions of Americans every single day. I sat with Bob for a long time that afternoon, explaining that his clumsiness wasn't a failure of his character or an inevitable result of his age, but a biological consequence of a drug-nutrient interaction that had gone unmonitored for over a decade. The medical establishment often calls metformin the gold standard, but for the nervous system, it can be a lead weight. When I checked Bob's B12 levels, they were in the low 200s, a range many labs call normal, but which I consider a state of emergency for someone with neurological symptoms. Bob had been living in a state of cellular famine while believing he was well fed. This realization that the cure was contributing to the disease is a bitter pill to swallow for any patient. But in that bitterness, there is also the seed of hope. If we know the cause, we can find the solution. I promised Bob that we would not just manage his diabetes, but we would bypass the trap and flood his system with the B12 his nerves were crying out for. We were going to stop the theft of his mobility and give him back the ground he had lost. Bob's struggle is a clarion call to every person taking chronic medication. You must be your own advocate, because what you don't know about your medicine cabinet can, quite literally, take the feet out from under you. Dorothy Higgins was a woman who lived her life in vibrant color. A retired kindergarten teacher from Portland who still wore bright sunflower earrings and smelled of cinnamon and craft glue. But when she came to see me, the color had faded from her cheeks, replaced by a sallow, grayish hue that spoke of a deep internal depletion. Dorothy had been struggling with chronic acid reflux for over 10 years, a common ailment of our modern, high-stress lives. To cope, she had been taking proton pump inhibitors, or PPIs, the purple pills you see advertised on every television screen, as if they were candy. "Dr. Gupta," she told me, her voice small and tired, "I feel like I'm living under a heavy woolen blanket,
Everything is muffled. My hands feel like they're wearing thick gloves even when they're bare, and I'm so exhausted I can barely finish a crossword puzzle. As a researcher, I knew exactly what was happening inside Dorothy's stomach, a place where a perfect storm was brewing.
Most people view stomach acid as an enemy, something to be suppressed and neutralized at all costs. But in the intricate ballet of human nutrition, stomach acid is a vital protagonist. It is the chemical key that unlocks vitamin B12 from the proteins in the food we eat. Without sufficient hydrochloric acid and a protein called intrinsic factor, vitamin B12 remains trapped in the meat or eggs on your plate, passing through your system like a locked treasure chest that no one has the key to open. By taking PPIs for a decade, Dorothy had effectively turned off the acid pumps in her stomach, creating an environment where B12 absorption was nearly impossible. She was eating well, or so she thought, but her nervous system was starving in a land of plenty. I explained to her that her muffled world was the result of her nerves losing their electrical conductivity because they lacked the B12 necessary for maintenance. This is the hidden danger of the pill for every ill culture we live in. Dorothy's heartburn was gone, but in its place, she was developing a slow-motion neurological collapse. Studies published in the Journal of the American Medical Association have linked long-term PPI use to a significantly increased risk of B12 deficiency, yet millions of people take these drugs without ever having their nutrient levels checked. For Dorothy, the fatigue was so profound that she had stopped writing letters to her sisters because her fingers could no longer feel the grip of a pen. She felt isolated, disconnected from her own senses, as if the world was drifting away from her. The acid storm isn't a storm of too much acid, but the chaos that ensues when we have too little. It is a biological silence that leads to the death of nerve signals and the darkening of the mind. When I looked at Dorothy, I saw a woman who was disappearing into the muffle of her own body. She had been told that her fatigue was just part of getting older, and that her numbness was unfortunate but common. I refused to accept that. I told her that we were going to address the root cause, not just the symptoms. We discussed how aging itself naturally reduces stomach acid production, a process called atrophic gastritis, which was already working against her. Adding a decade of PPIs to that natural decline was like pouring water on a dying fire. Dorothy's story is a reminder that our bodies are interconnected systems. You cannot suppress one function without affecting a dozen others. We had to find a way to soothe her reflux while restoring her body's ability to extract the magic of B12. We were going to pull back that heavy woolen blanket and let the world back in, one nerve at a time.
Dorothy's journey back to clarity began with understanding that the purple pill had a price she was no longer willing to pay.
In the quiet corners of my office, I often find myself reflecting on the giants whose shoulders we stand upon, the pioneers who turned death sentences into life-giving cures. One such story belongs to Arthur Sterling, an 85-year-old former jazz saxophonist from New Orleans, who arrived at my clinic with a heartbreak that no medication could touch. Arthur had lost his music. His fingers, once capable of the most intricate, soulful improvisations, were now wooden and unresponsive. He couldn't feel the brass keys of his beloved instrument. The connection between his soul and his sound had been severed by advanced peripheral neuropathy. He sat there, a man who had once filled the smoky clubs of the French Quarter with life, now reduced to a silent observer of his own decay. "Doc," he rasped, "if I can't feel the horn, I can't play the music. And if I can't play, I'm already gone."
To give Arthur hope, I had to take him back in time, to the 1920s, an era when a diagnosis of pernicious anemia was a terrifying death warrant. Back then, patients would become deathly pale, their muscles would waste away, and their nervous systems would collapse until they finally slipped into a fatal coma. There was no cure, no hope, only a slow slide into the dark. But then 3 researchers, Whipple, Minot, and Murphy, stumbled upon something that seemed like pure alchemy. They began feeding these dying patients nearly a pound of raw liver every single day. It sounds gruesome to our modern ears, but the results were nothing short of a resurrection. Patients who were literally on their deathbeds, unable to move or speak, began to sit up. Their color returned, and their nerves began to fire once more. They rose from the grave of their disease. This discovery was so profound that these 3 men were awarded the Nobel Prize in Medicine in 1934.
Yet the mystery wasn't fully solved. It took another 14 years until 1948 for scientists to finally isolate the magic hidden within that liver. What they found was a complex, beautiful, brilliant red molecule with a single atom of cobalt at its core. They named it vitamin B12, or cobalamin. This tiny red spark was the reason people were coming back to life. A second Nobel Prize was awarded just for deciphering its incredibly intricate structure. I told Arthur that he wasn't just missing a vitamin in the way people think of a daily Flintstone chewable. He was missing a fundamental molecule of survival, a biological key that had earned two of the highest honors in human history. B12 is the only molecule in the human body that contains a metal atom like cobalt, making it a unique, high-powered conductor for the electrical system of our nerves. Arthur listened, his eyes widening as he realized the weight of what we were discussing. He wasn't just old and worn out. He was suffering from a deficiency of a molecule so critical that its discovery changed the course of medical history. I explained that for a man of his age, especially one with his history of digestive issues, his body had lost the ability to harvest this red gold from his diet. His nerves were silent because they had no power to transmit the music of his life. We weren't just going to give him a supplement, we were going to perform a nutritional resurrection. We were going to flood his system with the same molecule that saved those dying patients in the 1920s. I watched a spark of hope, the first I'd seen, flicker in Arthur's eyes. He gripped the arms of his chair, and for a second, I could almost hear the faint, ghostly notes of a saxophone in the room. Arthur's journey back to the stage was going to be a long one, but it was anchored in a scientific miracle that had been proven nearly a century ago. We were going to bring the music back, not through luck, but through the power of the resurrection molecule. To truly understand why vitamin B12 deficiency causes such excruciating pain, we must look at the two-pronged assault it launches against the nervous system, a biological betrayal that I have studied for decades. As a researcher, I often describe B12 not just as a nutrient, but as the master foreman of a never-ending construction site. Its first job is a process called methylation, a high-speed chemical reaction that happens trillions of times a second in your body. In this process, B12 acts as a catalyst to transform a dangerous amino acid called homocysteine into a beneficial one called methionine. When B12 is missing, the foreman leaves the site and homocysteine levels begin to rise uncontrollably. This isn't just a chemical imbalance, it is a flood of poison. High levels of homocysteine are directly toxic to the delicate fibers of your nerves, actively corroding the very cells it should be protecting. While this poison is attacking from the outside, a second disaster is unfolding within the nerve cells themselves. Every single nerve cell contains microscopic power plants called mitochondria, which produce the energy required for every thought, movement, and sensation. Vitamin B12, specifically in its form as adenosylcobalamin, is the essential fuel these power plants need to function. When B12 is absent, the mitochondria begin to fail, and the cell enters a state of energy crisis. As these power plants shut down, a byproduct called methylmalonic acid, or MMA, starts to accumulate to toxic levels. This acid is particularly insidious because it doesn't just disrupt energy production, it actively sabotages the structural integrity of the myelin sheath. It is as if the fuel you put in your car started to dissolve the engine from the inside out. The result is a devastating double blow. Your nerves are being strangled by the toxic buildup of homocysteine on the outside and poisoned by the accumulation of MMA on the inside. This is why the symptoms of B12 deficiency are so much more severe than other nutritional gaps. It isn't just a weakness, it is a systemic demolition of the 45 miles of wiring in your body. This is why patients like Margaret feel fire, and patients like Arthur lose their music. Their nerves are literally being dissolved and starved at the same moment. The excruciating pain is the sound of a biological system in its death throes, screaming for the one molecule that can stop the carnage. I have seen the clinical data from countless studies, and it all points to this. Without B12, the repair mechanisms of the body are paralyzed. You cannot build new myelin if you are being flooded with poison. This is the nightmare that kept me awake during my early years as a young doctor. I would see patients deteriorating, their lives shrinking as their mobility vanished, and I realized that we were often missing the root cause because we didn't understand this two-pronged assault. We were treating the pain with narcotics, which only masked the symptoms while the poison and fuel crisis continued unabated. To truly heal, we must stop the poison and restore the fuel. We must provide the B12 necessary to clear the homocysteine and restart the mitochondrial engines. This is the core of neuroregeneration. It is a battle for the soul of the nerve cell, and it is a battle we can win if we act before the damage crosses the threshold of no return. Understanding this mechanism changes everything. It turns a mysterious pain into a solvable biological problem. We are not just fighting age, we are fighting a chemical imbalance that has a clear scientific solution. One of the most frustrating challenges I face as a physician with over 30,000 patients is the wall of misinformation created by standard laboratory results. I cannot tell you how many times a patient has sat in my office clutching a lab report that says their B12 level is normal, yet they are clearly suffering from the classic signs of nerve death. The problem lies in what I call the lab test lie. Most laboratories in the United States set the lower limit for vitamin B12 at 200 picograms per milliliter. This number is catastrophically low. It was originally designed to detect the absolute latest stages of pernicious anemia, the point where you are literally dying, not the point where your nerves begin to degrade. As a researcher, I have seen overwhelming evidence that neurological symptoms can start to appear when levels drop below 500. To tell a patient they are fine at 210 is like telling a pilot he has plenty of fuel when the gauge is hovering just above empty. I have fought this battle for years, pushing for a higher standard of care. If your B12 is under 500 and you have tingling, numbness, or pain, you are in a state of functional deficiency. But the lie goes deeper than just the number. A standard blood test only measures what is floating around in your bloodstream, not what is actually getting into your cells. You can have a normal amount of B12 in your blood, but if your body can't transport it into the nerves, you are still starving. This is why I insist on two critical functional tests: methylmalonic acid, MMA, and homocysteine. As we discussed, these are the toxic byproducts that build up when B12 is missing. If your MMA or homocysteine levels are high, it doesn't matter what your B12 number says, your cells are screaming for help. These markers are the true smoke detectors of the nervous system. I remember a patient who had been to 4 different neurologists, all of whom told her she was fine because her B12 was 250. She was nearly in a wheelchair by the time she reached me. When we ran the MMA test, it was through the roof. Her cells were drowning in acid even though her blood looked normal to an untrained eye. This distinction is the difference between a lifetime of disability and a successful recovery. We must stop treating the lab report and start treating the human being in front of us. If you have the symptoms, you have the problem. Regardless of what a flawed, outdated reference range says, you must be your own advocate in the doctor's office. You must demand the MMA and homocysteine tests because those are the only numbers that tell the real story of your 45 miles of nerves. The medical system is slow to change, and many doctors are still using the same benchmarks they learned 40 years ago. But science has moved on. We now know that the brain and the peripheral nerves are the most sensitive organs to B12 depletion. They are the canaries in the coal mine. By the time your blood levels look truly low by traditional standards, the damage to your myelin may already be irreversible. This is why I am so passionate about educating my patients. Knowledge is your shield. When you understand the lab test lie, you can no longer be dismissed. You can look your provider in the eye and say, "I am not fine and my cells are telling me why." This part of the journey is about reclaiming the truth from a system that has settled for adequate instead of excellent. Your nerves deserve excellence. If you walk into any big box pharmacy in America, you will be greeted by rows upon rows of bright, shiny bottles of vitamin B12. They are cheap, they are accessible, and for most people, they are a complete waste of money. As a physician who has spent decades studying the biochemistry of nutrition, I find it criminal that the most common form of B12 sold is cyanocobalamin. The name itself should give you pause. Cyano stands for cyanide. Yes, this synthetic form of the vitamin is actually bound to a cyanide molecule to make it shelf-stable and cheap to produce. While the amount of cyanide is tiny, your body still has to go through a laborious, energy-draining process to strip that toxin away and convert the molecule into a form it can actually use. For many of my elderly patients, or those with certain genetic variations like the MTHFR mutation, this conversion process is nearly impossible. They are taking the pill, but their nerves are still starving. I always tell my patients, we are not looking for a bargain. We are looking for a shield. The shield you need is called methylcobalamin. This is the bioactive, pre-activated form of B12 that your nervous system can use immediately. It doesn't require a complex chemical factory in your liver to work. It goes straight to the front lines to begin the work of repairing that crumbling myelin. When you use methylcobalamin, you are giving your body the exact tool it needs to lower homocysteine and stop the poisoning of your nerves. In my clinical practice, I have seen patients switch from the cheap synthetic version to methylcobalamin and experience a dramatic shift in their symptoms within weeks. It is the difference between trying to fix a high-tech engine with a wooden wrench versus the precision tool it was designed for. But the story doesn't end there. For those struggling with the fuel crisis in their mitochondria, like Arthur or Bob, we often need to add a second form, adenosylcobalamin. This is the specific form of B12 that lives inside the mitochondria and keeps the power plants running. By combining methylcobalamin, the shield, and adenosylcobalamin, the fuel, we attack the problem from both critical angles. We repair the insulation and we restart the engine. There is also hydroxycobalamin, a high-quality form often used in injections that the body can easily convert into whatever it needs. Choosing the right form of B12 is not just a health nut obsession, it is a clinical necessity. If you choose the wrong form, you are just buying a false sense of security while your 45 miles of nerves continue to wither. I often think about the scams in the health food industry, the fancy packaging and the bold claims, and it breaks my heart to know that people are trying so hard to be healthy but are being misled. When I sit with a patient, I help them read the back of the label. We look for those long scientific names because they matter. Your nervous system is a masterpiece of biological engineering. It deserves the highest quality materials for its repair. We aren't just taking a vitamin, we are performing a precision repair job on the most complex electrical system in the known universe. By choosing methylcobalamin, you are choosing life over cyanide and repair over decay. You are finally giving your body a fighting chance to silence the fire and bring back the music. One of the most common mistakes I see in my 30 years of practice is the belief that a pill is a pill. For a healthy 20-year-old, swallowing a B12 tablet might be perfectly fine. But for my patients like Dorothy or Bob, those over 60, those on multiple medications, or those with damaged digestive systems, swallowing a pill is often a futile exercise. The human digestive tract is a long, treacherous gauntlet, and vitamin B12 is a notoriously difficult traveler. It requires a specific set of conditions to be absorbed: enough stomach acid, a healthy supply of intrinsic factor, and a functional small intestine. If any of those links in the chain are broken, that expensive methylcobalamin you just bought will simply pass right through you, ending up in the toilet rather than in your nerves. This is why I often tell my patients, it's not what you eat, it's what you absorb. To bypass this broken system, we must look for the delivery of hope. The first and most accessible method is sublingual delivery. These are tablets or liquid drops that you place under your tongue. The area under the tongue is rich with tiny blood vessels, capillaries, that can absorb the B12 directly into the bloodstream, bypassing the stomach and the intestines entirely. It's a side door into the body that doesn't care about your stomach acid or your metformin. For many, this simple change in how they take their vitamin is the key that finally unlocks the healing process. I've seen patients who had been taking oral pills for years with no results suddenly feel the tingle of life returning to their toes after just a week of sublingual use. However, for those in the depths of severe neuropathy, those who can barely walk or are in constant agonizing pain, we must bring out the gold standard: intramuscular injections. An injection delivers 100% of the dose directly into the muscle tissue, where it is slowly released into the system. There is no guessing, no absorption issues, no interference. In my clinic, I have witnessed what can only be described as medical miracles following a course of B12 injections. I've watched men like Bob regain their balance and women like Margaret finally sleep through the night without the fire. The transformation is often so rapid and so profound that it brings tears to the eyes of both the patient and the physician. It is the moment where hope becomes a physical reality. We must also talk about dosing, because the recommended daily allowance, RDA, is a joke when it comes to nerve repair. The RDA is designed to prevent death, not to promote healing. When we are fighting active nerve damage, we need therapeutic doses. I typically start my neuropathy patients on 1,000 to 5,000 micrograms of methylcobalamin daily for at least 3 to 6 months. This loading dose is necessary to saturate the tissues and provide the raw materials for myelin repair. It is a marathon, not a sprint. Your nerves took years to degrade, and they will take months to rebuild. But with the right delivery method and the right dose, that rebuilding is not just possible, it is expected. We are moving beyond the pill and into a strategic clinical intervention that can change the trajectory of your life. Eleanor Vance was a woman of 72 who had spent her life serving others, a former nurse with a sharp mind and a heart of gold. But when she came to see me in Scottsdale, Arizona, she was terrified. She had been a strict vegan for 20 years, a choice she made for her health and her ethics. But now she was experiencing a terrifying fog. She was forgetting names, losing her balance, and felt a constant, distressing electricity in her legs. Eleanor was convinced she was developing Alzheimer's. She sat in my office, her hands trembling, and said, "Doctor, I can handle the pain, but I can't handle losing my mind. Is this the end of who I am?" I took her hands and looked her in the eyes. "Eleanor," I said, "it's not your mind that's failing. It's your foundation." I explained to Eleanor that while her diet was noble, it was missing the one thing her nervous system needed most. Vitamin B12 is found almost exclusively in animal products. Her dementia was actually a reversible neurological starvation. We began what I call the kitchen cure. While we used supplements to jumpstart her recovery, I taught her that long-term health is built at the dinner table. For those who can, the richest sources of B12 are organ meats like liver, the very thing that saved lives in the 1920s. But for others, it's about fatty fish like wild-caught salmon and sardines, grass-fed beef, and pasture-raised eggs. These aren't just foods, they are the building blocks of your 45 miles of nerves. I also warned her about the myths of the health food world. Spirulina and chlorella do not contain usable B12. They contain analogs that can actually block real B12 from working. But B12 doesn't work in a vacuum. To truly heal, you need a supporting cast. We added vitamin B1 in the form of benfotiamine, a fat-soluble version that is incredibly effective at protecting nerves from the caramelization caused by high blood sugar. We added MAGI, the nervous system's natural voltage regulator, to calm the overactive pain signals. And finally, we added alpha-lipoic acid, ALA, a unique antioxidant that can reach both the watery and fatty parts of the nerve cell. Clinical studies have shown that 600 milligrams of ALA daily can significantly reduce the burning and numbness of neuropathy. Within 6 months, the fog had lifted from Eleanor's mind. She was back to volunteering, her balance was restored, and the electricity in her legs had fallen silent. Her awakening was a testament to the power of giving the body exactly what it needs. My dear friends, if you are reading this, please hear me. Your pain is not a life sentence. You have 45 miles of nerves that possess a miraculous, God-given capacity to heal, but they cannot do it without the right tools. If you feel the burning, the tingling, or the numbness, do not wait. The time to act is right now, before the damage crosses that invisible line into permanence. Start by demanding the right tests: B12, MMA, and homocysteine. Choose the right form, methylcobalamin, use the right delivery, sublingual or injections, and build your foundation in the kitchen. B12 deficiency is a silent epidemic, but it is one we can defeat together. I have seen 30,000 patients, and I can tell you that those who take action are the ones who get their lives back. You are worth the effort. Your mobility, your music, and your dignity are worth the fight. If this story has touched your heart or opened your eyes, I ask you to do one thing. Don't keep this light to yourself. Share this knowledge with someone you love who is suffering in silence. And if you want to continue this journey of healing with me, please subscribe to this channel. My mission is to bring you the truth that the modern medical system often forgets, to empower you to be the master of your own health. Together, we can silence the fire and bring back the music of life. Take that first step today. Your nerves are waiting for you to save them.